On a quiet Sunday morning, the sun was just beginning to rise over a small town. In a peaceful neighborhood, the sound of birds chirping filled the air, and the streets were still mostly empty. The local black church, a simple but beautiful building, stood at the center of the community. People were beginning to gather inside, preparing for Sunday service. The church was a place of peace and safety for the people who attended, a place where they could come together, pray, and find support. The church had a long history. It had been a place of comfort for generations, a place where families had grown up and made memories. Everyone in the community knew each other, and they looked out for one another. It was more than just a place of worship. It was the heart of the town. People came to the church not only for spiritual reasons, but for emotional support as well. It was a sanctuary, a refuge from the troubles of the world. Among the people gathered in the church that morning was a man who had not always lived here. He had come to the town a few years ago after retiring from the military. His name was Marcus, and he was an Army Ranger, a soldier trained for the toughest missions in the world. When he first arrived in town, he had hoped to find peace after years of serving in dangerous places. But his past wasn't something he could easily escape. The war had changed him, and he often found himself haunted by memories of the things he had seen and done. Despite the quietness of his life now, Marcus had never fully let go of the skills he had learned during his time in the army. He still remembered every move, every tactic, and every moment of combat training. But here, in the church, he didn't need to be a soldier. He could be just another member of the community, sitting in the back pew, listening to the preacher's words. It was a different kind of battle now, one for his peace of mind. As the church service began, the sound of hymns filled the room. The congregation stood together, their voices lifting in song. The air was warm with the smell of incense, and the sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the wooden floor. It was a moment of calm, of connection, of community. Everyone seemed to forget about the outside world for a little while. But outside the church, things were different. A group of people, filled with hate and anger, were watching the building from a distance. They were a gang, known for their racist views and violent behavior. They had been making threats against the church for weeks, and today they planned to act on their hatred. The gang members didn't know that inside the church was someone who could stop them. They didn't know about Marcus, the Army Ranger who had seen more danger than they could imagine. They were focused only on their mission, convinced that they could push their hate onto the world. They didn't know what they were walking into. Back inside, Marcus continued to listen to the preacher, his eyes closed for a moment, trying to focus on the present. But something inside him felt uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He didn't know why, but his instincts, those instincts that had kept him alive in the toughest situations, were telling him that danger was close. Meanwhile, the gang members were gearing up for what they thought would be an easy attack. They had their plans in place, and they believed that the church and its people would be no match for them. Their hatred blinded them to the fact that they were walking into a place of unity and strength. The stage was set, the tension was building, and the community inside the church had no idea that the peace they felt was about to be shattered. The storm was coming, and no one knew how it would end. But for Marcus, this would not be like any other fight he had faced. This was not a battle for survival. It was a battle to protect the lives of those he had come to care about. The question was, would anyone know the danger that was lurking outside before it was too late? The sun had now fully risen, casting its warm light over the town. While the church's doors remained open, welcoming everyone who came for Sunday service, outside, the world was a little different. A group of people who had spent their lives filled with anger, hatred, and fear of others were quietly gathering in a secluded area not far from the church. They were a gang, a group of individuals whose beliefs were rooted in violence and division. They had heard of the Black Church and its strong community, and in their twisted minds, they saw it as a symbol of everything they hated. The gang, led by a man named Jared, had been planning for weeks. Jared was the kind of person who fed on hatred. He believed that the world was divided into two kinds of people, those like him and those who were not. His small group of followers, equally bitter and angry, shared his views. They believed that their actions, no matter how harmful, were justified. They felt that they had to make a stand against what they saw as a threat to their beliefs. For them, it wasn't just a church, it was a place that represented change, progress, and a future they didn't want. As they stood in the shadows, Jared gave a speech. His words were full of fire, igniting the group's already burning hatred. He spoke about making their mark on the town, about showing the world that they were not afraid to fight for what they thought was right. They won't know what hit them, he said, a cold smile spreading across his face. The church, their community, and anyone who supports them will understand that we are not to be messed with. The gang nodded in agreement, their faces hard with determination. They didn't see the consequences of their actions. They only saw their twisted version of justice. With each passing minute, their excitement grew, and so did their belief that they were in control of the situation. But they hadn't considered one crucial detail, the one thing they didn't expect. They didn't know who was inside that church. Jared and his gang had assumed that the churchgoers were nothing but easy targets, people who would fold in the face of violence. They hadn't anticipated the strength that lay within the walls of that building. They were so focused on their own plan that they failed to recognize that sometimes the most unexpected individuals are the ones who stand tall when everything seems impossible. "Get ready," Jared said quietly as he motioned for his group to move forward. They had their plan, and they were eager to put it into action. Jared's followers spread out, taking positions around the church. They tried to stay hidden, thinking they were being careful, but they didn't realize that their presence had already begun to unsettle the air. There was a strange stillness, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they prepared to make their move, one member of the gang, a young man named Kyle, looked uneasy. He had joined the gang out of fear of being left out, but as the day grew closer, he started to question the decision. He had heard stories from his family about kindness and compassion, about standing up for what's right. The idea of attacking the church didn't sit well with him, but he kept his doubts to himself. It was too late to back out now. The rest of the gang was too wrapped up in their anger to notice his hesitation. They were focused on the church, unaware that inside the building, the calm and quiet they had planned to disrupt was about to change forever. Across the street, the church's large wooden doors were still open, the sun now fully casting golden rays onto the floor inside. The congregation continued to sing, unaware that their peaceful day was being threatened. The Army Ranger, Marcus, sat quietly in the back, his instincts telling him that something was off, but he couldn't quite place it. He didn't know who was out there, but something in the air told him that danger was near. As Jared's gang drew closer to the church, they believed they had the upper hand. They didn't know they were walking into something that would challenge their very existence. In the quiet of the church, no one knew what was waiting just outside. But it wouldn't be long before everything changed. The church was alive with the sound of music as the congregation gathered together in unity. People of all ages stood side by side, their voices filling the room in beautiful harmony. The sunlight shone through the stained glass windows, painting the wooden pews in shades of red, blue, and yellow. It was a moment of peace, a quiet Sunday morning where everyone could forget the worries of the outside world and come together in faith and friendship. The church was more than just a place of worship. It was the heart of the community. Generations of families had walked through its doors, raised their children, and found comfort during times of struggle. For many, it was the one constant in a world that seemed to change so quickly. And on this day, as the music filled the air, no one could have guessed that danger was creeping closer with every passing minute. At the back of the church, Marcus sat quietly in a pew. He wasn't participating in the singing or the prayers. Instead, he watched with a calm, distant look in his eyes. He had done this before. He had sat in the silence, far removed from the world he had left behind. He had been an army ranger, someone who was trained to handle the most difficult situations. He had fought in battles, faced death, and seen things that most people couldn't even imagine. But here, in this church, he found a sense of peace that he couldn't find anywhere else. Marcus had come to this town after leaving the military. He had hoped that by moving far away from the chaos of war, he could finally find peace. And for the most part he had. He'd become a regular part of the church community, helping when needed, but always keeping to himself. He didn't share his past with many people. The memories of what he had been through were too heavy to talk about, and he didn't want to burden anyone with the weight of his experiences. But there was something different about today. Something was off. Marcus could feel it, deep inside him. It wasn't something he could explain, but it was there. An unease, a tension in the air that didn't belong. He tried to push it aside, telling himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the feeling only grew stronger. Outside, the gang was moving into position, their steps quick and quiet as they surrounded the church. But inside, the churchgoers were unaware of the danger lurking just beyond the doors. The music continued, and the preacher's voice rang out, speaking words of hope and unity. The congregation was wrapped up in the comfort of the moment, not realizing that it would soon be shattered. Marcus's instincts were always sharp. He had been trained to notice the smallest detail, to sense when something was wrong. His training told him that there was danger nearby. He didn't know where it was coming from, but he could feel the tension building, like a storm about to break. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of the people around him, the peaceful expressions on their faces. He didn't want to believe that anything bad could happen here, but the feeling in his gut told him otherwise. He sat there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should he leave? Should he warn the others? But what if he was wrong? What if it was just his mind playing tricks on him? Marcus knew better than anyone that sometimes fear could make you see danger where there was none. But then again, he also knew that ignoring your instincts could be deadly. The church's front door creaked as the wind blew through the open space. It was a small sound, but to Marcus, it felt like a warning. His eyes narrowed as he stood up, moving quietly through the rows of pews. He needed to get a better sense of what was happening outside. He walked to the back door, his mind racing with possibilities. What if he was too late? What if the danger had already come? He opened the door just a crack, peering outside. He couldn't see much, but he could feel the presence of something that didn't belong. His military training kicked in. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. There was something out there, and it was moving closer. Marcus took a deep breath and closed the door softly, turning back to face the congregation. He knew what he had to do. The peace of the church, the safety they had all felt, was about to be broken, and he was going to make sure it wasn't broken for good. Outside the church, the quiet town was waking up. The sun had risen fully, casting a warm golden glow over the streets. People were starting their day, running errands, and making their way to various activities. But behind the peacefulness, a storm was quietly gathering. The group of gang members, led by Jared, was moving closer to the church, their plans ready to unfold. Jared had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He had spent weeks planning, gathering his small group of followers, and building up their hatred. For him, this wasn't just about sending a message. It was about asserting control. He wanted to show the town that they couldn't hide from his beliefs, that no one was safe from his view of the world. In his mind, the church and its congregation represented everything he disliked, everything that was wrong. He saw it as his duty to stand against it. The group moved carefully through the streets, staying hidden from view. They were dressed in dark clothing, trying their best to blend in with the shadows. Jared, walking at the front, felt a strange sense of power. He was convinced that they had the upper hand. They were a group of people united by their hatred, their anger, and their belief that they were right. Nothing could stop them, not even the church or the people inside. They were certain that they could push their ideas onto the world, and no one would stand in their way. As they reached the edge of the church grounds, Jared stopped. He motioned for the rest of the group to follow him. His followers obeyed without question, eyes fixed on their leader. They were ready, eager to do what they believed was their mission. "Let's make this quick," Jared said quietly. His voice had an edge of excitement mixed with certainty. "They won't even know what hit them." One of the gang members, Kyle, looked uneasy. He had joined the group because he didn't know where else to fit in. His family had always spoken of unity and kindness, but Kyle hadn't felt it himself. The gang offered him a sense of belonging, but now, as he stood outside the church, the weight of what they were about to do pressed heavily on him. He had tried to ignore his doubts, but they were becoming harder to ignore. The calm and peaceful nature of the church was in direct contrast to the anger boiling inside him. As the group got closer, Jared motioned for them to spread out. They were preparing to make their move, taking up positions around the church so they could strike when the moment was right. Kyle hesitated, glancing back at the church. The door was still open, and he could hear the faint sound of music coming from inside. The church seemed so peaceful, so full of life. It was hard to imagine that something violent was about to happen here. But Jared wasn't thinking about the people inside the church. He was focused on his mission, on what he thought was right. He didn't see the people as individuals. They were just part of something he wanted to destroy. The gang members were all wrapped up in the same mindset, thinking that their actions were justified. Kyle took a deep breath and turned away from the church. He couldn't back out now, not in front of the others. He swallowed his doubts and moved to his position, keeping his eyes on the church. Meanwhile, Jared and his followers took their places, waiting for the signal. They were confident that they would succeed. They had the element of surprise, and the churchgoers would be too distracted by the service to notice them until it was too late. Inside, Marcus continued to watch. His instincts were still telling him that something was wrong, but he wasn't sure what to do about it. He stood near the back of the church, watching the faces of the people around him. They were lost in the service, their voices rising in unison, singing with joy and peace. He admired their unity, but he also knew that unity could be fragile. It was a gift, but it could also be easily shattered if the wrong person came along. The gang members were now in position, and the church was just a few moments away from being torn from its peaceful existence. Marcus didn't know exactly what was coming, but he knew he couldn't ignore the danger any longer. Something was about to break the calm, and he would be ready when it did. The warm light of the sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across the wooden pews. Inside the church, the congregation continued with the service, lost in the music and the preacher's words. The peaceful atmosphere made it easy to forget the danger that was creeping closer with every passing moment. But as the minutes ticked by, a sense of tension was beginning to build, unnoticed by most. Outside, Jared and his gang were ready. They had positioned themselves carefully, making sure no one could see them as they waited. Jared, at the front of the group, was calm, his mind focused on the task ahead. He believed they were about to make their mark, to prove that they could take control. His followers, though nervous, were eager to act. They had been prepared for this moment for weeks, and now it was finally here. Jared looked at his watch. The time had come. He gave the signal to move, and the gang quickly stepped forward, moving toward the entrance of the church. They were so sure of their success that they didn't even think twice. They believed the church and its people would be easy targets, and they couldn't wait to make their statement. Inside, Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was subtle, but the air had shifted. The sense of unease he had been feeling was now unmistakable. His instincts, honed from years of military service, were telling him that something was about to happen. His eyes scanned the room once more, taking in the peaceful faces of the congregation. They had no idea what was coming. Without thinking, Marcus stood up slowly, his movements quiet. He made his way toward the back of the church, his mind already calculating the best way to handle the situation. He had no idea who was out there, but he knew that whatever was about to happen, he needed to be ready. Meanwhile, the gang was closing in on the church. Jared led the group to the front doors, where they paused for a moment. They were so close now. Jared's heart was pounding, and his excitement was evident. He believed this was their moment to take control, to force their beliefs onto everyone inside. But as they reached the doors, they were stopped short. The church's front doors opened slowly, and Marcus stepped out into the sunlight, his calm demeanor hiding the sharp focus in his eyes. The gang members froze, momentarily taken aback. They hadn't expected anyone to be waiting for them. Marcus stood just outside the door, his eyes locked on Jared. For a brief moment, there was silence. The gang members, unsure of what to do, glanced at their leader. Jared's confident expression faltered for a second, but he quickly regained his composure. He thought they had the upper hand, and he wasn't going to let one person stand in their way. But Marcus wasn't just any person. He had been trained to handle situations like this, to assess threats and neutralize them with precision. He didn't make a move yet, but his stance was firm, ready for whatever came next. "You don't belong here," Marcus said quietly, his voice calm but firm. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. The gang members, uncertain and suddenly aware that they might be facing more than they bargained for, looked to Jared for guidance. Jared sneered, his anger flaring. "We're not leaving until we've done what we came here for," he spat. His voice was full of bitterness, but there was a hint of doubt behind his words. Marcus's eyes didn't leave Jared's. He knew what was at stake, and he wasn't afraid. He had faced much worse in his past, and he wasn't about to let this group disrupt the peace of this church. "You won't get what you came for," Marcus said, his voice steady and calm. Jared, determined not to show fear, motioned for the gang to move forward. But before they could take another step, Marcus did something unexpected. He moved with lightning speed, blocking their path. The gang, now realizing that they weren't dealing with an ordinary man, hesitated. Jared was the first to charge forward, but Marcus was already ahead of him. In an instant, Marcus disarmed one of the gang members, sending him stumbling backwards. The gang members, shocked and confused by Marcus's quick actions, started to realize that their plan was not going as they had hoped. What they thought would be a quick victory was quickly turning into something they were not prepared for. Inside the church, the congregation was still unaware of the unfolding drama outside. The preacher's voice carried on, and the music filled the room, creating a stark contrast to the tension growing right outside the door. But the church was about to change forever, and Marcus was ready. Outside the church, the gang members were beginning to realize that they had made a grave mistake. What they had expected to be an easy attack was quickly turning into a challenge. Jared, the leader, had underestimated the man standing before him. Marcus, the Army Ranger, wasn't just anyone. He wasn't some helpless target. He was a skilled fighter, trained for the toughest situations. And now, with the gang closing in, Marcus was ready to defend the people inside the church. The moment Marcus disarmed one of the gang members, the rest of the group paused, unsure of what to do next. They had expected to charge in and take control, but Marcus's calm and quick movements had thrown them off. They had never faced someone like him before. Jared, trying to regain his composure, motioned for the gang to continue their approach. He believed that numbers would win the day, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Marcus stood firm, his eyes locked on the gang, watching their every move. He wasn't about to let them harm anyone in the church. His instincts were sharp, and he knew that the best way to protect the congregation was to act quickly and decisively. Without warning, Marcus moved again. His training kicked in as he used his surroundings to his advantage. He positioned himself in the doorway, blocking anyone from getting inside. When one of the gang members lunged at him, Marcus sidestepped quickly, sending the attacker stumbling past him. The others hesitated, unsure of how to react. They had expected an easy fight, but now they were facing someone who seemed unstoppable. Inside the church, the sounds of the service continued, unaware of the growing tension just outside. The congregation remained focused on the preacher's words, their voices lifting in song, their hearts full of peace. They had no idea that their sanctuary was being threatened, but Marcus knew that it wouldn't take much for the situation to escalate. He had to act fast to stop the gang from reaching the churchgoers. Jared, frustrated by the unexpected resistance, motioned for his followers to regroup. He had underestimated Marcus, but he wasn't ready to back down. "Keep pushing," he shouted, trying to rally his group. "We're not stopping until we get what we came for." But the gang wasn't as unified as Jared hoped. Some of them were hesitant, uncertain about what they were doing. Kyle, the young man who had been struggling with his conscience, looked around at the others. He could see that things were getting out of hand, and he was beginning to question his decision to be part of this. His hands were shaking, and his heart raced as he looked at Marcus. Kyle had no desire to hurt anyone, especially not the people inside the church, but he was too afraid to speak up. Marcus, sensing the hesitation in the group, seized the opportunity. He moved with speed and precision, disarming another gang member before they could react. The gang, now losing their confidence, started to falter. Jared, still trying to maintain control, gave one last command to charge forward. But this time, the gang didn't move as confidently as before. They had seen Marcus in action, and they knew he wasn't someone to take lightly. The church's doors remained open, and the sounds of the service continued, peaceful and unaware. But Marcus, standing in the doorway, had a single focus: to keep the church and its people safe. His actions were swift, calm, and calculated. Each move he made was designed to disable the gang without causing unnecessary harm. He wasn't here to fight a battle. He was here to protect. The gang, realizing that they were outmatched, began to retreat. Jared's anger was clear, but he knew that continuing the fight wasn't going to end well for them. "Fall back," he shouted. "We're leaving." The remaining members of the gang hesitated for a moment, but they quickly followed Jared's orders. They retreated, moving away from the church and disappearing into the streets. Marcus didn't let his guard down immediately. He watched as the gang members scattered, making sure they were truly gone. Inside the church, the congregation continued with their service, unaware of how close they had come to danger. The preacher's voice continued to echo through the building, and the music filled the room, as if nothing had happened at all. Marcus, though still standing near the door, finally took a deep breath. He had done what he came here to do. He had kept the church safe. His military training had prepared him for moments like this, and his instincts had guided him every step of the way. He didn't need recognition or praise. He had done what was right, and that was enough. The tension in the air slowly faded as Marcus stepped back into the church, the door closing softly behind him. The battle was over, but the church had been forever changed. And so had Marcus. The sound of the church service continued to fill the air, a calm melody that contrasted with the tense moments that had just unfolded outside. Inside, the congregation was still absorbed in their worship, their voices singing praises and their hearts lifted in unity. They were unaware of how close they had come to danger, how a group of strangers had threatened their peaceful space. Marcus stood near the back of the church, his eyes scanning the entrance one last time. The gang had retreated, disappearing into the streets, but the air still felt charged with the aftermath of the brief confrontation. He hadn't been able to stop the fear from creeping into his mind, but now that the threat had passed, there was nothing left but the quiet hum of the service. Inside his mind, however, things were far from calm. He had lived through many battles, faced enemies in foreign lands, and learned to push through the worst of situations. But this was different. This wasn't a battle in a distant place. It was right here, in a community he had grown to care about. He had stepped into that moment without thinking, simply relying on instincts that had been sharpened over years of military service. And it had worked. The church was safe, and the gang was gone. Still, Marcus couldn't shake the thought that he had only been one person. What if there had been more of them? What if the situation had escalated? What if he hadn't been there? He tried to dismiss these questions, but they lingered in the back of his mind. The doors to the church had closed softly behind him, sealing off the outside world. The congregation continued singing, blissfully unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. Marcus took a deep breath and walked toward the front of the church, feeling the weight of the moment. As he made his way down the aisle, he noticed the eyes of a few churchgoers following him. They had seen him earlier, sitting quietly in the back pew, a stranger to them, but now they seemed to be looking at him differently. There was something in their expressions, curiosity, perhaps a little concern. They hadn't seen the events that had taken place outside, but they could sense that something had changed. When Marcus reached the front, the preacher, who had been speaking with passion moments before, paused. He saw Marcus and immediately recognized the tension in his posture. "Brother Marcus," he said with a warm smile, "you've been quiet today. I trust everything is all right." Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond. He wasn't someone who liked to draw attention to himself. He preferred the quiet life, blending into the background of the community. But now, standing before the preacher, he knew that there was something important he had to say. "There was a situation outside," Marcus said quietly, his voice low but steady. "A group of people tried to disrupt the peace here." The preacher's expression shifted, his smile fading slightly. He looked around at the congregation, many of whom had stopped singing and were now paying attention to Marcus. There was a murmur of confusion and concern, but Marcus raised his hand, signaling for them to remain calm. "It's over now," he continued, his gaze meeting the preacher's. "The situation was handled. The church is safe." The preacher nodded slowly, his face reflecting a mix of relief and uncertainty. "I see," he said, looking out at the congregation. "I believe we all owe you our thanks, Marcus, for keeping us safe." The room was quiet for a moment, and then one by one, the congregation began to nod in agreement. Whispers of gratitude filled the air. Some people looked at Marcus with admiration, while others appeared to be lost in thought. The sense of calm that had settled over the room began to return, but there was also something new, something unspoken. It was as if the church had been changed forever in those few moments of uncertainty. As the preacher continued with the service, Marcus stepped back into the shadows, quietly returning to his place in the back of the church. He didn't want attention, and he certainly didn't want to be the center of any praise. His mind still raced with thoughts of what could have happened, of the danger that had been so close. But for now, all he could do was be thankful that the worst had been avoided. The peaceful sounds of the church continued, as the preacher's voice rose with the spirit of the service. The congregation had returned to their songs, their hearts filled with hope and unity once more. But something had shifted. The calm that had filled the church earlier that morning had been replaced by a quiet awareness, a feeling that something important had happened, even though no one fully understood it. Inside, the church was a place of comfort, a sanctuary for its members. But now there was an unspoken bond among the people, a shared understanding that they had come close to something dangerous, something they hadn't expected. The quiet man sitting in the back of the room, Marcus, had quietly stepped forward when it counted. Without anyone realizing it, he had protected them all. After the service ended, the congregation slowly began to gather in small groups, talking quietly to each other, exchanging glances. There were no grand speeches, no loud exclamations. It was a calm understanding. They had all been protected, but they also knew that they would never again take the safety of their church for granted. As people began to leave, the preacher walked over to Marcus, who was still sitting quietly in the back, as he often did. The preacher had a grateful smile on his face, but there was also a trace of concern in his eyes. "You've done something no one expected, Marcus," he said, his voice gentle yet filled with respect. "You saved us today. We owe you a debt of gratitude." Marcus looked up at him, his expression calm. "I didn't do anything that anyone else wouldn't have done," he said, his voice humble, as it always was. "I just acted when I needed to. That's all." The preacher nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "But not everyone would have known what to do. You've got skills, Marcus. I don't think many people in this town would have known how to respond to what was going on outside. But you did." Marcus sighed, a small but noticeable shift in his demeanor. "I've had training for a long time. I've learned to act quickly when needed, but I don't like being noticed. I just wanted to make sure no one got hurt." The preacher put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "And you did. We're all safe because of you." He paused for a moment, looking around the room. "It's not just about the skills, Marcus. It's about your heart. You stood up for us today because you care about this community. And that's what matters the most." Marcus's gaze softened at the words. He had come to this town looking for peace, hoping to leave behind the life he had lived as an army ranger. He had hoped to fade into the background, to find some quiet place where the memories of war wouldn't follow him. But today, he had been forced to step forward and protect the people who had welcomed him. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want anyone to see him as a hero. But hearing the preacher's words, he realized that he had found something here in this town, something that was worth protecting. It wasn't just the church, it was the people, the community, and the unity they shared. They were his family now. As the last of the congregation made their way out of the church, several people stopped to thank Marcus. Some shook his hand, others simply gave him a nod of gratitude. It was a quiet acknowledgement, but to Marcus, it meant more than any applause or cheers ever could. They had seen him for who he was, not just a man with military training, but a man who had chosen to be part of something bigger than himself. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, Marcus stood outside the church, looking at the peaceful street. The gang had gone, and the threat had passed, but he knew that it would never fully leave him. He had become part of this community, and he would continue to stand guard over it, just as he had done that day. But now he knew that he wasn't alone. There were people here who cared for him, just as he cared for them. The town had changed that day. The church had been tested, and it had proven its strength. But it wasn't just the church that had changed. It was the people inside it. They had seen a side of Marcus they hadn't known before, and they had come to understand that sometimes it's not just about being strong, but about being willing to step forward when the time comes. And as Marcus walked down the quiet street, heading back to his home, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The road ahead wasn't always going to be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be.